The world is changing rapidly, leaving us scrambling to keep up.
Vance's Munich speech has sent shockwaves through the political landscape.
His bold statements and decisive actions have marked a turning point.
Supporters hail him as a visionary, while critics warn of potential fallout.
The international community watches closely as alliances and strategies shift.
Vance's leadership style is both praised and scrutinized as the world adapts to a new era.
In this dynamic environment, one thing is clear: there's a new sheriff in town. Into this volatile mix steps J.D. Vance, Trump's trusted lieutenant and the new Vice President of the United States. Vance's speech fully embraced the very forces that European leaders had spent decades trying to contain. The silence after Vance's speech was deafening, a collective gasp yet to find release. Vance's speech aimed to weaken the transatlantic alliance, marking a shift in global power dynamics. Ukraine, a pawn in Trump's game? Vance's speech had a particularly chilling effect on Ukraine, a country that had become a pawn in the larger geopolitical chess game between Russia and the West. Since Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 and its subsequent support for separatists in eastern Ukraine, the country had been locked in a bitter conflict with its larger neighbor, a conflict that had claimed the lives of thousands and displaced millions more. Ukraine had looked to the West, and particularly to the United States, for support in its hour of need. The Obama administration had provided Ukraine with non-lethal military aid, including training and equipment, but had stopped short of providing the lethal weaponry that Kiev desperately needed to defend itself against Russian aggression. Trump, however, had shown little interest in coming to Ukraine's aid. In fact, he had repeatedly questioned the value of NATO, the alliance that formed the bedrock of European security and Ukraine's best hope of deterring further Russian aggression. Trump's apparent willingness to appease Putin, coupled with his disdain for traditional alliances, had sent shockwaves through Ukraine, where many feared that their country would be left to fend for itself against a revanchist Russia. Vance's speech did little to assuage those fears, by suggesting that the greatest threat to Europe came not from external aggression, but from within. Vance had given Putin a green light to continue his meddling in Ukraine and elsewhere in the former Soviet sphere. The message from Washington was clear: the United States was no longer willing to bear the costs of containing Russian aggression. Ukraine, it seemed, was on its own. The implications of this shift in American policy were profound. If Ukraine fell under Russia's sway, it would deal a devastating blow to the credibility of NATO, and embolden Putin to further aggression elsewhere. The Baltic states, once part of the Soviet Union and now members of NATO, watched nervously, fearing that they could be the next target of Russia's revanchist ambitions. Vance's speech was more than just a diplomatic blunder. It was a reckless gamble, a high-stakes bet that the United States could afford to alienate its closest allies and undermine the liberal international order it had helped create. Trump, driven by his America First ideology and his disdain for multilateralism, seemed indifferent to the potential consequences of his actions. He appeared to believe that the United States, with its vast economic and military might, could dictate terms to the rest of the world, and that alliances were a sign of weakness, not strength. But Trump's gamble was fraught with risk. By alienating its allies, the United States was weakening its own position in the world and creating a vacuum that its rivals were all too eager to fill. Russia and China, sensing an opportunity to advance their own interests, were stepping up their efforts to undermine the existing world order and promote alternative models of governance that favored authoritarianism over democracy. The world that Trump seemed intent on creating was one defined by uncertainty, instability, and a return to great power competition. It was a world in which might made right, and alliances were fleeting and transactional. It was a world that bore little resemblance to the one that the United States had led for decades, a world based on rules, cooperation, and a shared commitment to democratic values. In the end, Trump's gamble was a betrayal not only of America's allies, but also of its own values and interests. By undermining the liberal international order, Trump was sawing off the branch upon which American power rested. The world that emerged from the wreckage of Trump's presidency was a more dangerous and unstable place, one in which the United States was no longer the indispensable nation, but just one power among many, its influence diminished and its moral authority tarnished. A transatlantic culture war. Values collide, alliances fracture. Vance's speech exposed a growing chasm between the United States and Europe, a chasm that went far beyond policy disagreements or strategic calculations. It was a clash of values, a fundamental difference in worldview that threatened to unravel the transatlantic partnership that had been the cornerstone of the post-war order. At the heart of this transatlantic culture war was a fundamental disagreement about the nature of identity and belonging. For decades, Europe had embraced a vision of itself as a post-national project, a union of states bound together by shared values of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Immigration, while not without its challenges, was seen as a source of strength and dynamism, a way to revitalize aging populations and enrich European culture. The United States, under Trump, had embraced a very different vision, one rooted in a nostalgic yearning for a more homogeneous past. Trump's Make America Great Again slogan was more than just an empty campaign promise. It was a rejection of the multicultural, multi-ethnic present in favor of a mythical past when America was, in the eyes of Trump and his supporters, a more unified and culturally cohesive nation. Vance's speech was an attempt to export this vision to Europe, to persuade Europeans to abandon their embrace of diversity and multiculturalism and embrace a more exclusionary vision of national identity. It was a dangerous proposition, one that threatened to unravel the fragile consensus that had held Europe together for decades. The stakes were high. A Europe divided along cultural and religious lines would be a weaker Europe, more susceptible to Russian meddling and less able to project its values and interests on the world stage. It would also be a boon to the forces of extremism and intolerance on both sides of the Atlantic, emboldening those who sought to exploit fear and division for their own political gain. The reckoning Europe at a crossroads. The aftershocks of Vance's Munich speech continue to reverberate, leaving Europe at a crossroads, grappling with an identity crisis and an uncertain future. The transatlantic alliance, once a bedrock of stability, now lies fractured, its future uncertain. The old certainties have vanished, replaced by a sense of vulnerability and a profound loss of trust. Vance's words were a wake-up call, a brutal reminder that Europe could no longer afford to rely on American protection. The era of American hegemony was over, and with it, the era of European complacency. The United States, once a guarantor of peace and prosperity, had become an unpredictable and at times hostile actor on the world stage, its actions driven by a volatile mix of nationalism, populism, and a disdain for the liberal international order it had helped to create. The challenge facing Europe was immense. To navigate this new and uncertain world, Europe would need to forge a new path, one based on self-reliance, unity, and a renewed commitment to its founding principles of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. It would require a fundamental shift in European thinking, a willingness to overcome historical divisions, and to pool resources in the name of collective security. But even as Europe grappled with these existential questions, the forces of division and fragmentation were gaining ground. The far right, emboldened by Vance's rhetoric and the perceived weakness of the liberal order, sensed an opportunity to advance their agenda of intolerance, xenophobia, and authoritarianism. The firewall that had long protected Europe from the resurgence of extremism was crumbling, its foundations weakened by years of economic uncertainty, social unrest, and political polarization.